Hola, buenas noches. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por venir. Mi nombre es Javier Agustín Rojas y soy el director del CEAC, del Centro de Estudios de Arquitectura Contemporánea. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de organizar una actividad con la Maestría en Historia y Crítica de la Arquitectura que dirige Liernur. Vamos a recibir al profesor Leach, que vino a dictar un seminario desde Australia, aquí. Antes de cederle la palabra a Pancho para que les cuente un poco más de nuestro invitado, les quiero compartir el resto de las actividades que tenemos para las próximas semanas. Tienen acá en las mesas de ingreso este calendario, que es toda la programación del semestre. No me quiero detener en el resto de los eventos, pueden verlos con su agenda, simplemente contarles los próximos dos que vienen, las próximas semanas. El lunes 14 de abril, eso es en 2 semanas, vamos a presentar el primer libro del archivo Amancio Williams realizado por el Canadian Center for Architecture. Va a estar presente Claudia Schmidt, que está acá con nosotros, directora del área de Historia de la carrera de grado de Arquitectura. Claudia visitó el archivo en Canadá 2 veces, si no me equivoco, en un programa que tiene el CCA que se llama Out of the Box, donde invitan a diversos arquitectos, practicantes, historiadores a visitar el archivo y tener una lectura creativa y personal sobre lo que encuentran. En esta presentación también vamos a recibir a Mauricio Peso y Sofía Bueno-Richhausen, quienes van a venir de Chile. Ellos estuvieron trabajando sobre la Casa del Puente y derivados. Y también va a estar Martín Uberman, quien se encargó de la digitalización del archivo Williams antes de hacer el traspaso al CCA. Y al día siguiente, el martes 15, vamos a tener una conferencia magistral de la arquitecta Janet Kuo, del estudio con base en Zurich Caramus Kuo. Ahí tenemos 2 eventos, uno al lado del otro, por temas de agenda de Semana Santa, así que bueno, se los aviso con anticipación para los que quieran venir, se pueden organizar. Bueno, sin más, los dejo con Pancho, director de la maestría, que les va a contar un poquito más de Andrew Leach y del evento de hoy. Gracias.
Bueno, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes a todos, todas. Creo que algunos que me conocen deben tener alguna idea de lo bien que me pone tener esta conferencia, auspiciar esta conferencia en la escuela. Digamos, para los que no lo saben, para mí Manfredo Tafuri es una figura central, y en realidad lo conocí a Andrew no a través de un libro publicado, sino trabajando yo mismo en un texto sobre Tafuri, a través de haber pescado en la red su tesis doctoral, que fue sobre Tafuri en la Universidad de Ghent en Bélgica. Para mi sorpresa, porque en general la verdad es que no me encuentro con muy buenos trabajos sobre Tafuri, me encontré con un trabajo estupendo. Realmente me sorprendió, como digo, muchísimo, por parte de un joven que estaba graduándose, con una profundidad y digamos, un conocimiento de lo que estaba trabajando realmente excepcionales. Desde entonces quise conocerlo. Lo he ido siguiendo a través de algunas publicaciones y demás, y digamos, me alabo a mí mismo diciendo que tuve la excelente idea de proponerle al decano invitarlo para en este semestre para que en parte nos ayude con los seminarios en la maestría, pero además y sobre todo para que pueda dar esta conferencia y compartir con ustedes algo de lo que Andrew conoce acerca de este tema. Debo aclararles además, agregar que sigue trabajando, ahora están trabajando con Luca Cansi, ¿no? En una cuestión que es central y que es traducir en inglés los escritos de Tafuri anteriores a 1964. La imagen de Tafuri, el lugar de Tafuri en la historiografía, digamos, global, tiene mucho que ver con la forma en que sus ideas fueron recibidas en los Estados Unidos. Y lamentablemente en los Estados Unidos mucha gente, salvo excepciones, suele leer solamente inglés y no otros idiomas. Y a pesar de eso, escriben sobre autores de otros idiomas sin conocer esos idiomas en profundidad. Y entre otras cosas, eso ha hecho que se lea un Tafuri, se conozca un Tafuri a nivel internacional, como si hubiera sido siempre un marxista extremo y solamente hubiera vivido entre 1969 y 1975, más o menos, o 1978. Y esto, como es obvio, no fue así. Él tuvo una vida anterior y una vida posterior a eso, y una producción anterior y una producción posterior. Y entonces el trabajo me parece que va a ser importantísimo, porque ahí hay un proceso y hay unas ideas que son igualmente desafiantes y que ayudan a entender en parte cómo siguió y en parte con qué rompió también cuando fue cambiando a lo largo de su vida. Así que esa diría yo es la razón fuerte por la cual Andrew está aquí, y además es decir que le agradezco muchísimo. Les cuento que él vino vía Pacífico y paró en Santiago de Chile, y él me acaba de contar ayer que la azafata le preguntó cuánto tiempo iba a estar en Buenos Aires, y él le dijo, bueno, llego hoy y me vuelvo el domingo, viniendo de Sídney. Y la azafata le dijo, lo mismo que nos vamos a estar nosotros, o sea que lo que va a estar acá es el tipo de descanso que se toman los tripulantes de un avión, nada. Y hacer eso realmente es para agradecer, porque es un esfuerzo muy grande, está en medio de muchísimas ocupaciones, así que se lo agradecemos muchísimo. Brevemente les digo que Andrew nació vive en Sídney, en Australia, pero nació en Nueva Zelanda. Estudió en New Zealand, en la Victoria University en Wellington, y completó sus estudios como decía, la Universidad de Ghent en Bélgica, donde se doctoró. Es profesor de la Universidad de Sídney, donde enseña desde 2016. Y ha tenido otras posiciones docentes en otras instituciones, y también, por ejemplo, en la Pennsylvania State University en Estados Unidos, y en la Villa I Tatti, en Roma, etcétera, etcétera. Muchas actividades de este tipo. Ha escrito y ha publicado su Manfredo Tafuri en 2007. 2007 fue the dissertation was 2007, and the publication?
6 and 7.
6 and 7. Okay, 6 and 7. 6 en 2006 fue la disertación y 2007 la publicación. Después tienen otros libros: What is Architectural History, The Baroque Architectural Culture, Rome, un libro lindísimo sobre Roma, Architectural Culture 1980, y un libro que me parece muy interesante, que es Crisis on Crisis, Italian Imprints on 20th Century Architecture, que es sobre la contribución italiana, del pensamiento italiano a la arquitectura en el siglo XX, lo cual es enorme y muy poco conocido, y es un trabajo que editó de muchos autores que participaron en el libro, muchos autores muy conocidos de gran valor. Además ha publicado, codirigido revistas de arquitectura como Architectural Theory Review, Journal of Architecture, etc. Es decir, tiene una actividad más que intensa, tanto en publicaciones, en dirección de publicaciones, y en clases y en difusión en conferencias como esta. De nuevo, muchas gracias, Andrew, y me gustaría que los recibamos con un aplauso.
Thank you, Pancho, for that incredibly warm welcome. Can you hear me okay at the back? I want to begin by thanking you for this very warm welcome to Buenos Aires, a city that I first encountered myself at the turn of the present century, more years ago than I'm prepared to entirely admit. But it's a city that left a very deep impression on me, or at least on a much younger version of me. So, thank you, Pancho, for bringing me back. Thank you, Florencia, for making it happen, and for setting up both such a stimulating program, a program that we will pursue with the students into the coming weeks once I am back in Sydney. I want to thank the students as well, with whom I've been working these last 2 days, especially for their willingness to jump into something as specific and obscure as I have brought to them, the modern historiography of architectural mannerism. We're bringing it back. It's going to be all that anyone talks about for the next few years. Most of all, I want to thank you for this evening, indulging me in sharing progress on a current publication project that sees me return to things that I have been reading and thinking about for a long time also, even from before I first set foot in the city. My greatest risk is telling you things that you already know. You're a learned city, I know this, and I beg your indulgence if this is the case. I promise that we leave room for some vigorous discussion in the end of things that are a little too familiar for you, so feel free to press me. For sure, I begin somewhere familiar. For sure, I begin somewhere familiar, but we'll move beyond it fairly quickly. So let's begin. I have long been drawn to the writing and teaching of Manfredo Tafuri, one of 20th century architecture's most demanding, infuriating, and stimulating scholars, who from the end of the 1960s onwards obliged a generation of architects to turn to the idea that, while architecture may populate our cities and staff our landscapes, it has no agency therein. And this by design, not architecture's, even though architecture allowed it, but rather by the flows of money and power that shape what is possible, with architecture as with everything else. Much of his reputation beyond Italy has been shaped by his book Progetto Utopia, pictured here in its first edition, translated into English as Architecture and Utopia, which was published a little more than 50 years ago. And presented a clarion call to change the way we practice and think about architecture. Just imagine, he wrote, if what we did when we sat at the drawing board or the typewriter mattered, which is to say, mattered to people who weren't architects. He reached this plea by means of the most disagreeable path possible, namely by showing architecture, as of the middle of the 20th century, not to matter. And its efforts to do so, to start to matter, something of a welcome distraction. This, at least, is how it appeared to many of his readers. Think of Manhattan's grid, he implored. What happens in each city block can be anything, because real power lies with the grid itself, something perhaps to which you can relate. He writes here of the golden age of American eclecticism, but with this line he diagnoses a reality to architecture's situation that extends well into the 20th century, and we can perhaps argue for how long it continues to hold up. This call did not, as you can well imagine, land so well in every quarter, and especially among those who traded on the ideas of responding to society on its own terms, of design as the tool of the hour for social intervention, of a modern movement shaping the city, designing for communities, participatory design, and so forth. Tafuri had declared the death of architecture when the caption of these drawings, one of which I'm showing, prepared by Aldo Rossi, Arquitectura Assassinata, responding because, yes, how better to prove Tafuri wrong than with a series of watercolors. Tafuri wrote from a platform he was able to construct for himself at the University Institute of Architecture in Venice, UAV, where he effectively took over Bruno Zevi's role of teaching architectural history by making his way towards that chair from an assistantship in urbanism. Here I'm showing an image from the major exhibition curated by Zevi together with Paolo Portoghesi in 1964 on the figure of Michelangelo, the architect, Michelangelo Architetto. Since the very end of the 1950s, Tafuri had worked tirelessly to locate himself as a voice in national debates on architecture and its history, and on Rome in particular, in which so much of the Republic's imagination of itself was materialized. While teaching at Milan with Rogeris and then at Palermo with Brandi, he wrote what I think remains the most comprehensive study of the 16th century, the long 16th century, and architectural mannerism, from which basis he penned a book that did more to clarify the task of teaching history to students of architecture and of writing and thinking about history at all, Teoria Storia dell'Architettura, and hence for locating historical inquiry in architectural culture, really clearly locating its position and locating history as the frame in which architecture conceives of itself as architecture. This book does more than any other to address these themes, and from it he both taught and wrote admittedly difficult articles on the major ideological systems governing the nature and operation of 20th century cities and of architecture therein. Without hesitation, I regard this book on the right, Teoria Storia, as his most important, most fundamental, and most long-lasting work. He publishes this at the age of 33, far from being his first book. This is like book number 6. And I was talking just a few months ago in Athens with Panagiotis Tonikiotis, recalling for him that I found his book on the historiography of modern architecture very important for me at a formative age, and he just kind of started nodding and says, yes, we all write our most important books when we're very young. So it was a nice moment. While Tafuri was becoming increasingly serious and systematic about the study and practice of architectural history, he nonetheless insisted on asking questions that many readers associate with Progetopia, but which are entrenched in his earliest writings from as much as a decade beforehand, from 1959 onwards. Where does architecture sit in the flow of money, he asks, in the structures of urban or national governance, or within the processes that see the architectural project realized as building works? The answers on which he landed were consistently bleak, or so it seemed, to his architectural readership. Not least this is because he felt perpetually let down himself by the architects of his own city, of Rome, who seemed, in his view, powerless to stop decisions taken by the city and native developers, and the church as a major real estate investor. His answers also seemed to point to the need for barbed critiques. The call-outs are really nice, and this page spread of Italia Nostra. And incisive accounts, the need for barbed critiques and incisive accounts of where architecture had gone wrong. A project of fostering historical consciousness, a critical consciousness of architecture, against which we would come to identify in later years the Venice School of Architectural History that took shape around the department that he came to chair for close to a quarter of a century. And hence the bursting lecture halls that held his classes on American housing, Russian master planning, fin de siècle Vienna, the architecture of Borromini, and the world of Nicholas V. And beyond that, the boom of theory and criticism as a cultural industry, an institution even in its own right, with its own momentum. My position is that the peculiar pattern of the arrival, and it's not just my position as you've heard in the introduction, the peculiar arrival of Tafuri's work into English, and especially the first of his books to appear in that language and to appear in the American Northeast, did a lot to skew his reception in many places around the world in English and beyond English. And we've been speaking, Francesco and I, these days about the difficulty of wrestling with the North Atlantic centers of academic power. This is one product of it. In returning to Progetopia more than 50 years after it first appeared, I wonder if No. I think, though, we can better appreciate that those who read Architecture and Utopia, and I use the English advisedly, when it first appeared in that language in 1976, or in any of its other translations, and I will rehearse them shortly, that the argument Tafuri explores throughout Architecture and Utopia did not come from nowhere. Nor did it come solely from an attentive reading to the Marxist classics, even if Tafuri was quite evidently a consumer and connoisseur of them, as was true of much of his generation. It is a product, in part, of the circumstances of his early life and education, a product as well of his nascent life as a professional architect and planner, and as a counter-institutional polemicist, working in a collaborative way to establish an informal school of architecture and urban planning to educate a generation that had been poorly served by the august Roman institution from which he himself had graduated. Following the publication of this book in Italian, 1973, a series of translations followed. Into German in 1978 as Kapitalismus und Architektur, into Dutch in 1979 as Antwerpen Utopie, I have the cover for that a little later, appearing in the same year as Dunod published the French edition Projet Utopie. A Japanese edition, pronunciation of which I don't have, followed 2 years later. A year before, Projet Utopia appeared first in Italy, recasting 2 essays that Tafuri had published, not without difficulty, in the journal Contemporánea. It took him, I'm told, by those in the room, that he found it difficult to assimilate his approach to these questions with those of the very tight-knit group of Venetian thinkers that controlled this journal, so that his paper was rejected in the first instance. He was sent away to learn better reading. So before this journal had first published his work in 1969, a year before Progetto Utopia arrived in Italy, 73. In 72, Spanish-speaking readers were already trading notes on the essay collection pictured here, De l'Avanguardia e la Metropoli. Excuse my pronunciation. This proliferation suggested that the criticisms Tafuri leveled at modern architecture, as it had been realized to date, had, if not universal merit, they resonated with audiences everywhere they landed, always as part of a library that looked different in every place. And that the principles both espoused therein and with which Tafuri took issue themselves had something of a universal character within that moment. To the extent that, and the covers as well, the covers say a great deal about what each setting that takes his work up finds irreducible. Is it Dada? Is it Piranesi? Is it the Enlightenment? Each book has its own way in that connects it to the specific culture of translation and uptake. And I like that in conversation with the original La Terza edition, the first in the Saggi Toscabili series, that it is an imperfect, an unclosed circle. Every one of these, the books of this series, played with the circle in different ways for dozens of numbers. Okay. To the extent that our author, in his late 30s, when this book first appeared, had a view of the world, that view was inexorably shaped by his encounter with what he clearly and vocally understood as the failings of urban planning and the municipal administration, and the readiness of architects to live with failure and impotence, all in that lustrous eternal city of Rome. Rome was the city of his birth. It was the city in which, as a child, he had to hide from German soldiers and fear of the trains departing from Tiburtina. It was a city transformed by British bombs and American dollars. His Rome had seen the Ventennio Fascista to its end, but protected the positions of fascism's most prominent architects within the university where he studied. It was a city being transformed at the dimension of the neighborhood, traffic systems, peripheral expansion, and housing development, rather than the monument, plain to every student who wondered why they were not being prepared by the Faculty of Architecture for this new world of structural transformation at a new urban scale, the new urban dimension in the language of the moment. When we encounter the angry young man of Progetto Pia, we encounter somebody who knows his own city, Rome, quite literally as a battleground, and who understands that its institutions, from the organizations looking out for the interests of architects to those training architects as students, could not be less interested in working to make the architect more relevant to the reality with which they were surrounded, and could not be less interested in trading comfort for its counterpoint. Tafuri's Rome, Rome of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, was a city perpetually in danger of destruction through its own forces, held in delicate tension as an idea, anchored to monuments in which that very idea was embodied but also calcified. A city in danger from its own growth, and what Tafuri understood as the insipid governance that managed that growth to the advantage of the most powerful of the city's actors. I'm ventriloquizing his positions, but he persuades me quite a lot. What does this tell us of the problem of reading Tafuri's books and articles in the present day? On the one hand, we have a circumstantial history in which our main actor is formed by events around him, in which he in turn seeks to shape, although he's reticent about explaining exactly how he seeks to do so. He doesn't do this all on his own, but rather through organizations looking for opportunities to build and plan and influence public opinion. On the other hand, we encounter a specific setting in which the broader currents of modern urban planning play out, and in which the principles of Siam and the Athens Charter attested to breaking point by forms of governance that set aside all those qualities that cannot be measured in favor of a city managed by technocrats on behalf of property developers and those powerful institutional interests that likewise gain from their profitability. It's a broad and an aggressive claim, but he has plenty of examples to back it up. Tafuri had studied architecture at Rome in a time of social and political transition. The majority of the professors under whom he studied had comfortably retained positions, as mentioned earlier, that they first secured during the fascist era. And the task of an architectural education was first and foremost one of composition and acculturation. The professional landscape he encountered on his graduation in 1959 was one grappling with the impending National Urban Master Planning Program initiated by the ruling Christian Democrat government. Therein, which opportunities to practice were dominated by the production of new urban amenities on the peripheries of large established cities, a measure to cope with a population exploding through industrialization, urbanization, and northern migration, the production of housing, principally under the auspices of the Ina Casa program. Wait, I'm out of step. I'm just going to keep that there for a second until I realize what's happened. Principally under the auspices of the Ina Casa program, and what he regarded as the demolition of monuments, traditional public amenity, both privately and institutionally owned, and sites of communal life in favor of commerce and development. And here is an AIUA, Architetti Urbanisti Associati, his office, the office to which he belonged, to flatten the hierarchy I've just implied. A project by the office published in Urbanistica to rethink the traffic pathways of the Villa Savoia. One of a series of new public parks, or at least old estates being turned into public properties across Rome in the 1950s and 60s. He confronted this problem in a couple of ways. First, he went into practice, I'm back on, not with an established architect, but with a group of fellow travelers, who traded under the name Architetti Urbanisti Associati. Others in this office included Lucia Barbera, Bernardo Rossi Doria, Stefano Re, Massimo Teodori, and Enrico Fatinanzi, along with another dozen names, some familiar, others not so familiar, that were involved in various of their projects. People drifted into different apartments and out of different apartments, and competitions happened, things were typed up. It was a very fluid situation that had something of, well, if not an anchor, it had a logo. The logo was as much of an anchor as the situation called for. Their main work, taking a drawing and then positioning it in media, their main work was in entering competitions for elements and master plans, like the work of many, many architects in Italy in this moment, for the design of new administrative and commercial centers on the edges of cities up and down Italy, mostly without success, almost entirely without success, a very small number of very modestly realized architectural commissions. There's a house, there's a restaurant, but a series of exhibitions as well. They pitched for work in Italy, they pitched for work further afield in Europe. They lost to Le Corbusier in the commission to design a new hospital in Venice, as did so many others. The purpose of their practice was to reorient their tools as architects and activists, as we shall see, to the domains in which could be found those commissions where the city was being shaped, and almost never for the better. Here is the set plan of when 1958, which Tafuri consistently accuses as a conception of a city on technocratic lines, something against which he wrote regularly, if not consistently. Tafuri and his contemporaries had ideas about how things could be made better, which located an idea of architecture as an agent of cultural good at its center, something hopeful amidst criticism of a situation that would seem hopeless. All of these architects wrote, and they wrote a lot. They wrote quickly, and it has to be said, they often wrote badly. I say this now as somebody who's trying to translate some of these early works into English. It was important for them not only to intervene in the professional problems of their moment, but also to understand where those problems had come from. Why, when the modern movement had offered so much promise, had it so spectacularly failed to prevent the predatory behaviors of property developers? Why did the grand gesture of Julian Rome, the Via Julia, plowed through the fabric of the medieval city from 1510 onwards, why did it now, in 1962 at least, end with a privileged view of the Cavalieri Hotel, the embodiment of American investment in the city fabric, but also a bold and unapologetic claim upon the cultural supremacy of the city with this fundamental axis. I'm not showing the axis here. You have to imagine looking up underneath Michelangelo's bridge. Boom! There's the hotel in the distance. These are, I think, credit to Davide Spina for this image as well. It's from a very, very fine article of his published in GTA Papers 2 or 3 issues ago, explicitly about these operations of real estate developers and building companies in shaping the post-war Roman city. I really recommend this work to you as I pass by it. These are, I think, reasonable questions to ask of a city in flux. And while they had little effect on the course of events, the Olympics came and went, the ring road was built, the parks were transformed, housing continued to be laid out in the model of the Ina Casa program. Despite all of these reference points, this specific engagement with a single city fed into what would become core tenets of Tafuri's critical reaction to modern architecture across the 1970s and 1980s. This general assessment, this wide-ranging assessment of the trajectory of modern architecture, of the state of architecture as of around 1970, comes from a very specific experience, a very specific, very Roman experience. Even as he himself attempts to move past it, he cannot help but be shaped by the battles having been conducted in Roman streets, of the arguments being held with other architects and protagonists in his own city. If one arm of this generational action, that's an early scheme of Del Debbio for the Faculty of Architecture, if one arm of this general action was pointing towards the practice of architecture and the practice of urbanism within the city, jostling to stand side by side with such figures as Luigi Moretti, Bruno Zevi, and Ludovico Quaroni, another was oriented towards architectural education. For failing to prepare students for the realities of contemporary architectural practice, professional practice rather, and for masking over the historical conditions that gave rise to those very realities, the university was useful, they argued, only for issuing diplomas that would allow someone to just get on with things. Students left the grand halls that had been designed with the Duce's blessing by Enrico Del Debbio, still in need of an education, a fundamental education in architecture. The Associazione Studenti Architetti was established as a counter-school of architecture for anyone in search of a way forward from this morass. The collective, another collective, though inevitably overlapping, read tirelessly, wrote insistently, debated new projects, held each other accountable for new design work, and threw cobblestones at the police. They were in the middle of the action when the students in 1963 decided to occupy the office of the Dean of Architecture for a month and a half, in protest at the nature of their education. They were instrumental in advancing the candidature of the three professors brought in to solve these same issues. The polemical history teacher Bruno Zevi, returning to Rome from Venice, someone with whom Tafuri would develop an antagonistic relationship, but which in this moment was a much stronger relationship in which Zevi supported Tafuri, and Tafuri wrote well of Zevi's interventions. This alongside his colleague Luigi Piccinato, as well as the architect urbanist Ludovico Quaroni, on whom Tafuri wrote his first book in 1963, and who came from Florence. He wrote two books of his were published in 1963, when he is, I find the maths depressing, so it's helpful to rehearse it, when he's 28, his first two books. Tafuri was within, it's worth tracking. Tafuri was within its center of gravity, as were Vieri Quilici, Giorgio Ciucci, Mario Magnarelia, Sergio Bracco, and Giorgio Piccinato, many of whom he would later call to Venice to serve in his Institute of Architectural History. Emerging from the rubble of the student actions, which had been widely supported by the younger end of the profession, and thus described something of a generational engagement, Dean Saul Greco had led a program of research and discourse, permitted perhaps is the better word, a program of research and discourse on an idea for which the ASEA group, Architetti Studenti, had advocated in the early 1960s, the city territory, La Città Territorio. At the heart of this work was the claim that architecture's remit should not be limited to the design and oversight of fine, discrete projects, but rather extend into that domain of decision-making that had been overtaken by technical planners. Those social scientists operating close to either the Capitoline government of Rome or the national decision-making body of the Institute of Urbanism or the State Public Service. The trading of design, which is to say the art of composition, and the curation of socio-spatial relationships, in other words, for management. It's a slightly fuzzy image, I'm sorry for that. The impact of routing traffic around a public park rather than through it might seem sensible and even quantifiable, but the social and economic balance of the slightly wider view, understanding the relationship between mobility and money, large-scale property owners, and the efficacy of the laws to which they were subject, required a holistic view of the city that neither those in positions of power nor those offering them expert advice had, in the eyes of this generation, been able to demonstrate. Rome at the turn of the century was much larger than it had been in 1870, when nationalist forces conquered the papal army, breaking through the Aurelian walls, but it was nonetheless defined more or less in that moment, 1870, by the wall itself. By 1960, 90 years later, the power of the wall was a distant memory. The city spilled out in every direction beyond this container that had survived for 1,000 years, 1,500 years. One of the curiosities of Tafuri's writing from these years is his interest in new developments in Japan. Another country, like Italy, engaged in the long and arduous process of post-war reconstruction, extending from the literal reconstruction of cities razed by warfare to the embrace of an open, indeed capitalistic society, both fueled in no small part by American investment, and using the Olympics in part to get there. Among the small and yet rather pointy volumes published by the Roman press Capelli out of the Asea stable in these years is Tafuri's 1963 study on the modern architecture of Japan, only a couple of years ago published in English by the the London-based publisher MAC, with a commentary by Ken Tadashi Oshima. Oshima, I should say, he, many years ago, published an article which I think is the basis of his introduction, in which he systematically showed that, in the end, Tafuri knew absolutely nothing about Japanese architecture. He got names wrong, he got situations wrong, his judgments about what exactly had happened were entirely off. It was something that he wrote from the library. He had never been to Japan. It was something that he'd written from the library. I come back to another point. An article, I'm getting ahead of myself, I get too excited. An article published in the Roman polemical journal Argomenti di Arquitectura in 1961 likewise considered Kenzo Tange's efforts in the process of master planning Tokyo. The scheme published just 3 years earlier. Tafuri's knowledge of the specifics is very light, very, very light, and entirely derivative from what he could read in places like Casabella and Domus. But in his hands, and before a Roman readership, Tokyo becomes a lens through which to see Rome with greater clarity. And Tange becomes a stand-in for the legacies of a heroic modern movement. And hence, for Tange, we might read Moretti or any of his contemporaries, those figures trying to solve, in a large-scale way, new territories within the city. While we have become quite used to reading Tafuri's books and regarding his teaching as being averse to lessons derived from history, it's perhaps enough to recall the phrase la critica operativa, operative criticism, instrumental criticism, to know that he has certain problems with certain ways of doing things in this business. These early pieces are entirely preoccupied with what Rome can learn from Tokyo, from Philadelphia, from Frankfurt, and from such projects as Quaroni's reconfiguration of the Bareni di San Giuliano at Mestre in the Veneto, a signal drawing of which adorns the cover of Tafuri's first book, which I showed a little earlier. What do we learn from Tokyo as architects in Rome at the outset of the 1960s? That a positive utopianism, as he puts it, Tafuri's phrases are, I barely need to put quotation marks up, that a positive utopianism on behalf of the architect demands civic and political commitment, but also an informed and open-eyed engagement with the machinery of government to ensure, again Tafuri, operational constancy, and to ensure that passive governance never gives way to empty action. Okay, let me tell you now about some new work. Well, some kind of new work. The project to collect and represent Tafuri's juvenilia is not mine. It's not mine. Even if it extends efforts that I made as a doctoral student to forcibly figure these works into a reassessment of his entire oeuvre. It was really my determination to read from start to finish and to understand the contours of a library that was entirely different to what I thought, to what I was encountering in secondary analysis of his work to that time. The foundation of this new work is another book in Italian, pictured here, Da Progetto alla Storia, edited by, so from the project to history, edited by my friend and good colleague Luca Scanzi of the Politecnico di Milano. It is a document of the remarkably recent détente between the Faculty of Architecture at Venice and Tafuri's widow, Giuseppa Pisarda, herself a scholar of Soviet cinema, which explains something of his preoccupation eventually with Eisenstein in La Sfera del Labirinto. So between Pisarda and their daughter Daphne, who is a Roman-based artist. Family who long resisted, for complex and personal reasons, not entirely illegitimate, prior efforts to elevate their late husband and father's legacy. For orientation, I should say, he died in 1994 at the age of 58. Young. There is, for instance, a very limited, there was at a certain moment no archive within the last 2 years. There is a very limited archive now. There's no archive beyond the institutional record that you have launched in the last couple of years. And papers are either locked or destroyed. We don't know their exact condition. I keep hearing hypotheses and rumors, but really the only people who know are never going to say anything. And I've heard stories of books marked Ex Libris Tafuri on the market for 30 years, cited here and there on the antiquarian market. I've never found one myself. That would be, tragedy, yes, but also very nice to have. But no, I don't have anything, and nor have I seen them, or I would have them. But a careful diplomacy, and this is an important part of the story of how we can begin to approach this early work. A careful diplomacy opened the way to an institutional program of research that's already paid off. Indeed, this book, Da Progetto alla Storia, was a kind of authorized attempt, authorized by the family and by UAV, an authorized attempt to gather together some of Tafuri's early writing on the city in particular. This is the thematic thread that keeps all of the essays, the 8-9 essays in this book together. It includes, for example, there's a lot of detail there. This is just to give atmosphere rather than information. It included the manifesto of the Associazione Studenti Architetti, Tafuri's history of architectural practice in Italy in the decade and a half after the war. I think this could be the most important of his early writings, La Vicenda Architettonica. A reflection aping his sometime teacher, Giulio Carlo Argan, on the emerging informal design movement. A really turgid piece of writing in which he's trying to understand something while he's also trying to explain it at the same time. Not the only occasion in which he does this. There's a representative piece on the efforts of the Conservation Society Italia Nostra and the cover that it offered his office, IUR, in pursuing its goals. He writes on the implementation of Rome's first post-war master plan, the corrective of Mussolini's master plan of 1932. He writes on the problem of retaining historical centres while developing commercial and administrative centres on the periphery, new administrative centres on the periphery. He writes on the frame of the city territory as one bridging architecture, urban planning, and city management. And from this list you can see it's preoccupied with the problems of doing architecture in the present moment and the conditions in which the new architect enters into the profession. The book was published a couple of years ago by Quadlibet, a really great Italian press, which has, in the meantime, I mean, this year, last year, it published a new edition of Venezia Renacimiento from a book of 1985 with a new foreword, and if it is not already published, it's about to be published, a new edition of the very hard-to-find Ricerca del Rinascimento, Tafuri's last major book, published in 1992, and this with a foreword by Carlo Ginzburg, which I really look forward to reading. In discussing with Luca, I mean, a very handsome picture of him there, he can also be not serious. In discussing with Luca whether and how to bring this book to an English language audience, and thinking about the work that it could do in rendering these, yes, obscure, yes, juvenile, yes, hastily written essays, presenting them in a serious way with a serious press. The book will be published by MIT. We agreed that there was scope to offer a more complicated view of the young Tafuri, to present him as somebody exploring his options in seemingly irreconcilable directions, in different configurations of friendships and alignments, and as well aspirations. This sense of him having options and exploring them is not something that comes through in this original book, which is focused very much on the world of his practice and the world of his polemical intervention into the city of Rome, when his let's say, his party of co-belligerents is much more clearly defined, and the sphere of action is much more clearly defined. We thought to move further out and to bring in some things that even don't really read or sound like Tafuri at all, that he nonetheless did. It also meant working hard to deliver translations of the writing that we could stand behind. This is the complaint. This is the complaint that anybody will say, that Tafuri is very hard to understand because he's very badly translated. When I myself rehearsed this for the last time to a friend in Venice, Mario Michelis, he said, "Wow, if that was true, then Italians would understand him," and they don't. So I took a lot of comfort from that, and I stopped talking about the translations in this way. It has to be said, though, yes, that Tafuri is notoriously poorly translated by professional editors. Technical words, phrases that have an historical specificity that are particular to the student movement and the world around it. These can be translated in a way that doesn't correspond to the English words that we use to describe any of these things. They can be over-translated by scholar translators who go out of their way sometimes to really explain what it is that he's saying, as well as representing what it is that he's saying, with a lot of colouring in, as I have put it, in foolishly commenting on somebody else's translation effort many years before thinking of doing one of my own. Let's see if that comes back to haunt me. And this from a starting point of the writing itself being overwrought, often inelegant in its original form. As a writer, he consistently tried too hard. I don't think, even if the papers are finally made available, should they have survived, I don't think we're going to find boxes and boxes of early drafts of any of these essays. What he wrote is what was published. First draft, for sure, even with factual errors. Sometimes he's forced to go through an editorial process, and then you can see what could be done with his voice when somebody who really understood writing and publication audiences, let's call them that, when somebody who really understood writing as a form of communication rather than simply writing as a form of expression laid their hands on his work. It's also often rather nice when he's working together with somebody else as an author, because his co-authors are regularly quite clear in what they have to say, which he rarely is. So we face the same problem. Between us, Luca and I are making translations that try to keep this voice in play, translating bad writing into bad writing, to be consistent, to maintain his awkward youthful style, not to break down sentences that can last half a page too much, unless it's really not clear what the subject is here to here. And yet to present a translation that also one can read well in English, that works, that is faithful to the original Italian, but which has something to say for a new readership. It's not easy. We had, just to describe it in very pragmatic terms, Polytechnic di Milano paid for a commercial translator to make a full translation of everything before we really understood what exactly it was that we were doing. But it was unusable. The English didn't make sense for one thing, but also this problem that I described earlier of technical terms, historically specific terms. All of this had been messed with. So I started working closely. I speak Italian poorly. I read Italian well enough. I learned Italian to read Tafuri, which says something about the nature of my Italian. And so I work with a degree of anxiety that I don't get everything right. And so the final part of the process, which we're engaged with 2 evenings a week over Zoom, is that I read slowly the English translation aloud to Luca, who follows along in the Italian, and he catches me when something goes wrong. It's a very simple process, but the effect is of a final product which is faithful to these ambitions that I've described, which is correct, and which polishes the English only insofar as it is strictly necessary, which is not at all my inclination. As Pancho mentioned in the introduction, I've done a lot of editorial work. My inclination is to take the red pen and really render Tafuri very clear, because his points in the end can be rendered very clearly, but this is also a document of its moment, and I want it to remain so. We want it to remain so. So in addition to representing Tafuri's writing on the city, which is to which we've added a long and early essay on the design and implementation of the Via Nazionale. This is what's now called the Piazza della Repubblica. This new edition will include, for instance, fragments reflecting on the key figures of the modern movement. This is in the original, but we've kept it. Fragments from an encyclopedia released in 1961 on that contains a lot of profiles of modern architecture. So here is Tafuri on Eero Saarinen, in which he, so 1961 this happens, so he's 25, he defines architecture. He gives a pages-long account of what architecture is, which, to be fair, is a potted history of the early modern movement through to its post-war manifestations. But I think that is a rather bold thing to do at such an age. It sits right alongside the entry Architetto by Gustavo Giovannoni. So generationally quite distinct, writing from very different positions of authority. And he writes as well contributions on Italian architects for a dictionary of Italian biography. He writes a long account. Oh, I've got this around the wrong way. So he also writes this long account of the trajectory of Roman architecture in the immediate post-war period. His assessments are brash, but they're not disconnected from what he would say in a more measured way later. The book will also include two long historical essays, one published with his IUR colleague Lydia Soprani on historiographical problems in the Norman architecture of Taormina, and how to date the Palazzo dei Duchi di San Stefano and the Badia Vecchia on the basis of the fabric itself, a kind of close reading of the building, and on the Baroque planning of the little town east of Rome of San Gregorio da Sassola in relation to its medieval starting point. So what's the nature of the Baroque overlay on this medieval hill town? At what moments is the novel work stitched into the original fabric? Again, a close reading of the fabric itself, not of the documents, not of the ideas beyond the architectural ideas and ideas of the relationship between urban form and city management, but a very close reading of the work. It includes previously unpublished writing on, untranslated writing, on Louis Kahn and Philadelphia, on Ernst May and Moscow, on William Morris and Berlin, addressing Pevsner's book As He Goes on the arts and crafts origins of modernism from the 1930s. It documents somebody following his nose, guided by intuition and interest, but not yet guided by fixed rules about what to pick up and what to put down. He takes opportunities, he responds to invitations. If there's a gap and an opportunity to publish, he seems prepared to do so, whatever the circumstances. To my mind, this sheds light. This sheds light not only on the relationship between Tafuri's formation and his most famous book, in English at least, Progetopia, with which I began, but also on his career in general, which was wide-ranging, seemingly caught between precise analytic work in the history of architecture, the kind of scholarship that is interesting only for other scholars, and, on the other hand, the politicized engagement with architecture that's proper to his generation, but which moves across epochs, from the 15th century to his own present day. In part, he and his collaborators argued the mess in which the city found itself, and hence in which they found themselves as architects looking to break into the city, was a consequence of leadership by administration going too far as a corrective to the dictatorship of earlier decades and the cult of personality that had inflected not just the national experience, but also that of architectural education and culture writ large. Architecture's weakness in the situation of Roman urban planning, disengaged as it was and ultimately ignored, was in part a result of this formative failing, and in part a consequence of architecture turning its back on problems like the organization of the city in order to realize works in aid of the expansion of the middle-class suburbs in Rome's north, especially, and hence the large developers who were turning church property and aristocratic land holdings into middle-class housing projects, with all of the city-sponsored and republic-sponsored infrastructure building that enabled new suburbs to connect to existing infrastructure. In light of this, the palazzo was a kind of symbol of architecture's retreat from real conditions affecting the lives of the city's inhabitants. I think it important to step back to these precise targets. In the title of her 1988 memoir, Autoritato di Gruppo, a self-portrait of a group, the historian Luisa Passerini offers us a useful device. There is an extent to which we can read a collective history through one person's eyes, especially when party politics and common reading serves so well to shape that experience. But in the end, the individual is the individual, and history needs also to respect the specificity of that experience and where it leads. hence the title of my own book, Choosing History. It's not a generational choice, it's a private choice that has generational implications. The early writing that Tafuri sent to press, either under his name alone or co-authored with others, treads something of this fine line. Clearly, and especially when written under a corporate authorship, Tafuri was speaking for a group, the size and efficacy of which we can seek to understand on its own terms. On his own, we understand something of that part of the collective that belongs to him alone. And everyone I've spoken to from this moment who knew him describes him as being both within and outside of every group to which he, in which he was related, in which he maintained a relationship, with which he maintained a relationship. By 1964, he begins to move away from the Roman groups that were important to him from the end of the 50s through the early 1960s, not only by taking on teaching jobs in Milan and Palermo and Venice to establish himself as a candidate for an ongoing position, as he later conceded to Pasolini, who recorded a long, and I think problematic, a long oral history, very long oral history in 1991, 92, 93, which I think, on reflection, even though I trusted it at an early moment, I think is a masterwork in operative criticism, of really establishing the lines in which we, those coming to him and his work in later years, the lines that we ought to pursue in properly understanding his history as determined by he himself. So, as he later conceded to Pasolini, shortly before his death, something of the principle of Hope, das Prinzip Hoffnung, invoking Ernst Bloch, had been exhausted by the realities of the Roman situation, but was not entirely extinguished for the world entire, for the broader world. As real as Venice and its persistent workerist currents might have been, there would always be something in Venice that constitutes something of a stepping away from reality, even if to look back or look out and to see reality with a little more clarity. What then is the value of reading these articles today, or indeed of continuing to read a figure like this? On the one hand, there is the simple task of getting to understand a body of writing and thinking better in all of its complexity. Let's call it an intellectual project of reading for the sake of understanding. By reading these pieces, we can understand something of the development of the ideas of a figure like Tafuri as he reached forward towards those books for which he has become, among certain people, somewhat famous. The title of our volume will be of the von Witt's formula, From Crisis to Commitment, invoking the choices available to the young Tafuri and the proximity of these choices to his ambitions, both public and private. On the other hand, this rereading, also allows us to admit a less than heroic profile for the younger and less powerful actors operating in a scene of urban debate and urban professional formation. We cannot turn to Tafuri for the truth of the matter, but we can understand from him something of the frustrations, of the preoccupations, and of the deliberations of a generation of young architects, rightly preoccupied with the ways in which the city of Rome was in the process of remaking itself. Coming back to these articles, and this is the end point, I guess, or at least one end point. I've stood in the spot where this photograph was taken. The photographer, whose name I've forgotten, Tim Potter, was long associated with the British School at Rome, also in the Valle Giulia. And while the students were finally rioting on the street, arguably necessitating the involvement of armed forces, the Battle of the Valle Giulia, it was called. Here was Tim Potter with his camera, looking over the balustrade of the British School from the tennis courts to document this with a really beautiful series of photographs. I think they're quite extraordinary. Coming back to these articles that lead to this moment, is not simply a major exercise in arcane scholarship, even if it is for someone like me that as well. A chance to read more carefully, very carefully, trying to capture Tafuri's voice as I see it on the page, to read things that I had earlier read quickly and understood imperfectly, even if coming back to these, it's quite reassuring to see that my quick reading was not entirely at odds with what actually existed there. Even if the details are specific to a time and a place that is definitively past, they convey the lump form of arguments that would be redefined as Tafuri not so quietly oriented himself towards a life in history and criticism, and entered the university as the institution best equipped for holding society and architecture within it accountable to its ideals. Time would see these observations from the late 50s and early 60s covered over again and again as Tafuri's criticism moved from local and immediate challenges to those giving direction to 20th century architecture writ large. For us today, these are usually short, scrappily written, and entirely local essays are something of a curiosity attached to a figure who, on his move to Venice, and in the wake of his enormous influence that he constructed from there, is much better and more rightly known for other things. But they are also reminders of how one can take action before one is granted agency. And I think that is a useful thing to consider. Thank you. Questions and complaints?
Right.
Thank you, Andrew, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Now we open up for conversation. Anja?
No. Okay. No. They are not really probably questions. One thing I was thinking about this, the idea of rereading, because it's, in a certain sense, I thought is optimistic, because all this period is actually it was not read. It's not a rereading; it's a reading. No, for most of the people, no, it will be a reading. Of this text and on this period. But anyway, even if it could be very simple, I was wondering really what will be the necessity to do this, to reread Tafuri, not in the sense of, not from a point of view of an academic, which is important, but for young architects, for architects I would say, for young architects and for young students also, why we should read and eventually reread Tafuri today. This is, I think, it's a very, for me, it's a very moving question, and really it is. So what would you say about that for us?
The starting point is that it's different everywhere, of course. Some city cultures, national cultures are more intellectually vigorous than others. But I know that where I work and live, that there is no culture amongst students and young professionals of trading in ideas to a wider community. So I think there is at one level a model of an early practice in which the ambitions that a young architect has on behalf of the world are clearly expressed, even if even if they land in a limited way, even if, yes, he changes his mind a year or two later on this or that point. So I think at one level there is a model of argumentation that is that's worth recalling. It's worth recalling. The second is that Tafuri exists for, I mean, to the extent that that anyone is made to read his work, to the extent that anyone chooses to read his work, he exists as a kind of caricature of himself. And I think one of the jobs of history is to always sniff out these moments where something is being constructed in such a way, and to bombard it with the facts to make those caricatures dissolve. That's for me one of the real projects of this work, is to say, I mean, as recently as last weekend, I was in a four-way Zoom debate that was being recorded for publication on Tafuri's work. I work on other things. I'd just like to be clear on this as well. The compere of the debate really understood the first moment of Tafuri's of his involvement in problems about which anyone might care as being this essay of 1969, which comes into a book of 1973, which is published in English in 76 and reified by the American Northeast. And so I instinctively, first I reject that this is the most important book. I think it's an important book, but I think I will argue for Teoria Historia on every occasion. But secondly, these small pieces show that chronology is all wrong. That trying to make sense of his positions by reconciling him with the books and debates that are current in Venice at the turn of the 1970s is a decade too late, a whole decade too late. The idea of Contemporánea being his journal is just incorrect. It's simply incorrect. He was an imposter, and treated as such. He was somebody whose Roman formation, he carried with him in his backpack all the way up to Venice, and when he arrived, the books were out of fashion there. So how do you treat this figure with a kind of dignity in his own history? I mean, he himself had this beautiful phrase from 1993, La dignità dell'attimo, the dignity of the moment. How can we understand history as having legitimacy outside of what we think now is important? So this act of putting things into the world is for me a kind of project of helping to rebalance the assumptions that one makes. Of course, sending this to exactly the same press that makes Architecture and Utopia, The Sphere and the Labyrinth, Venice and the Renaissance is also something of a polemical move, because now these things have to sit in their catalogue alongside the books that have been misunderstood, according to us. So that's something we were very pleased to have got away with.
But don't you think it will, at least in a certain sense, and for me it will be a form of suicide? Oh, sorry. No.
I was saying, don't you think that he's nowadays, in a way, anachronic?
Of course.
So,
yes. Sure. I mean,
so for you, it's just a topic, like it could be you could study, I don't know, some moment of Quaroni or whatever other topic, from like we do as academics, but it has nothing to do with contemporary architectural culture. You are saying that?
No. I mean, I think you can be both anachronistic and everywhere in the present moment. And I think that in Tafuri's case, he's constantly rehearsed in important places. Students learn these abstractions about him. They have to read in Michael Hayes' anthology the foundation essay of his work. And so, yes, in one sense, of course, your approach as an historian, those topics that cross your path, catch your eye, and it could be this as much as that. Sure, I admit that. But the value of this, and the reason why, well, the value of this is proven a bit in the fact that here I am in Buenos Aires, 25 hours flying or whatever it was, I forget, from Sydney in order to talk about these things, and you came along. There's a curiosity about this figure that is persistent, and it's not just here. It's in the US, it's in Europe, it's in Australia. I talk about Tafuri, not only about Tafuri. I need to be clear on this, but when I talk about Tafuri, it's to a room full of people who are still trying to understand something of him. So yes, while there is a dimension of this which is me applying skills and knowledge to a body of his work that I could equally be applying to a body of somebody else's work, that other person doesn't capture in an enduring way architecture's cultural imagination like this figure does. And so it's the persistence of his figure in the cultural imagination that is almost the logic behind, it's the logic behind a publisher taking on the book, it's the logic behind making the effort to talk in public and to have conversations about the work. It's a kind of proof that however anachronistic he might be, however old-fashioned he might seem if he'd lived much longer than he did, however problematic the way that he frames his subjects, that he frames the limits of architecture and its history, geographically, chronologically, that nonetheless there's still something in there that itches, and that itch we constantly scratch, regularly scratch. Why? I don't know. It's perhaps because of his singularity. And I think he was a rather singular figure in that the body of his production is not something that has ready correspondences with the work of other scholars and architects. But I think too it's the ferocity of these early works that forced the architectural culture of his moment to respond. I think this reaction to him of the profession of architectural culture standing up, listening, talking back, defending its position, forming positions around the antagonism that he plants in the middle of their culture. I think that is something that hasn't gone away in our imagination. Finally, I also think that nobody has issued an invitation as clearly as he does to consistently and constantly be alert to our own historicity. I think he's the person who made that argument very clear, and I don't think that anyone has yet improved on that argument. So there's a position as well that whether we read it in the pages of Teoria Historia or we've simply absorbed it through teachers and grand teachers who did read it in the pages of that book, it is a position that is everywhere in contemporary architectural culture, whether we invoke Tafuri or not. And I think for that reason as well, I think this is the job of doing history is to take these things and to pull them out and to make them clear again. People can choose to look or not, but they can't deny their existence, and that then becomes a new kind of burden, which, history's job is to leave things in the way so that people trip over. It slows them down.
Well, if there's not any other questions, I think, yeah, Claudia?
Thank you very much, Andrew, for your wonderful lecture. You used several times along your speech the word battlefield. The word battlefield,
yes.
no? The campo de batalla. And also Tafuri used that expression to talk about architecture. And he says that it's the day before of the. So the question is about the refinement of his criticism, because the period you choose to do these translations is the more the tension and the conflict in architecture. And then when he writes another text, he always show and invite us to discover the battlefield in the work. It's something that I learned not from Tafuri, from Liernur. But what do you think about that? Or what happened with that idea in at least in this selection?
I think it never properly goes away. I think the battle shifts from stones and papers to intellectual work. But I think it's almost a schema of his way of approaching history that he describes Piranesi's Campo Marzio as an epic battle waged by architecture against itself. I mean, an amazing image. And at the same time, we travel down through history, through the catalogue of his work. In Venice, we find the tension between then the architect and the proto. We find the tension between princes and architects in Ricerca del Rinascimento. I think tension is where historical situations come alive for him. Whether everything needs to be a battlefield is I think not, but there are moments in which if it's not a full battle, then it's a conflict. If it's not, I mean, we were recalling just before the Armonia Conflitti, the wonderful book on San Francesco della Vigna. That conflict is the thing that gives us purchase, looking back, looking on upon an historical situation.
That's why it is not anachronistic to read Tafuri.
Okay, good. I'm happy to have support. No, but I think it never. I mean, I don't think anachronistic to read Tafuri ever. In the same way that it's not anachronistic to read anybody really. But he himself is a kind of. I mean, you read him and you have an atmosphere that's not of the present for sure. But that atmosphere as well floats above the page and loses some of its specificity and becomes something that can prompt you to think about the present moment in a way that he for sure could not anticipate. For sure. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for your lecture y muchas gracias a todos y a todas por venir.